Welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Bryan Clark, a senior fellow at the Institute and director of the Hudson Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for viewing online. We're here to talk today about the US, Australia, and UK agreement, or AUKUS, I guess US, Australia, UK, US agreement, AUKUS. Make sure I get that right. Agreement which has been in the news a lot recently. We wanted to have an event to kind of talk about some of the issues surrounding the executability of AUKUS, what the benefits of it might be, and how it might be a model for other US allies and partners. To have that conversation, we've got two terrific guests with us on this panel today. John Lee, who is a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute, as well as an adjunct fellow over at the United States Studies Center in Australia. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Sydney. John has served in several positions inside Australian government, including in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he's been involved in the writing of white papers and advising of senior members of the cabinet there in Australia. So thank you very much for being here, John. Also with us today is Henry Sokolski, who's the executive director of the Nonproliferation Education Center, which is a co-sponsor of today's event. And Henry has been serving in and out of government for many years and has been the executive director there for several years. He has written a wide number of papers on nonproliferation and some of the challenges involved in keeping our country and the world safe from nuclear weapons. So thank you very much for being here today, Henry. So I want to start out by asking John, what is Australia looking to get out of the AUKUS agreement?
Well, I thought it would be quite useful just to frame why we wanted AUKUS in the first place. And I'll begin with a couple of key documents that were released publicly, the first being the 2016 Defence White Paper. That Defence White Paper was quite pivotal because it was the first time that the maritime region to our north and northeast, essentially East Asia and Indian Ocean, became the primary and overwhelming determinant of force posture for the Australian Defence Force. Previously, Australia, as many of you would know, we've engaged with the Americans in every major war that you guys have been in since World War II. Right. But a lot of our forces were designed as expeditionary forces, particularly land-based forces to support you guys in places like the Middle East. So for us to then conclude that suddenly Asia was going to be the geography, particularly maritime Asia, to shape the way we determine our future military, that was quite revolutionary. Right. 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper, which you mentioned, I was involved with. That was the first time we sort of conceived of our region as being fundamentally contested, particularly between, if you want to put it this way, authoritarian states, led obviously by China. And there was a belief that the democratic states, which are really the US and allies, needed to work together to balance against the Chinese. Or the way we put it in the white paper was to create a favourable balance that would favour the interests of democracies. And the most recent document that's significant, the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, this is when we started speaking about acquiring the capabilities to help shape and deter. So there was much more of a military seriousness to giving effect to that sort of strategic outlook that had been articulated. The other thing that's happened leading up to AUKUS is, and this is not really a secret, the assessment we've made of our environment, particularly Northeast Asia and particularly Taiwan, is now a lot bleaker than it was before. People used to speak about the potential of conflict sometime into the nether. I think the assessment we have now is, given the developments in China, in the PRC, it is not unrealistic for there to be a conflict probably over Taiwan in the next 5 or 7 years, not sometime way out there. And the other assessment we made was that with the PRC, if there were a war over the Taiwan Straits, it doesn't stop there. Right. What the PRC is doing is not all about Taiwan anymore, and we know that. So that meant that there was more likelihood, in fact, high probability that Australia would probably be involved if the balloon went up in Taiwan. Now, all that leads to AUKUS because our military forces as I mentioned, was sort of designed, one, to fight very distant wars in far-off places, particularly land wars, and secondly, we were not ready to even consider fighting a war against a potential high-end competitor in the next 5 or 7 years. Now, in 2017, I think, Australia and the UK, we were included in the American National Industrial Base, which allows military-industrial cooperation, but not a lot of progress has been made. And I think AUKUS sort of speeds that along, and that allows us to acquire those capabilities at within the next 5-6 years that we may need to significantly contribute to a potential war effort. Finally, I know AUKUS, a lot of people think of nuclear submarines because of the drama of the announcement and the cancelling of a French contract as well. And look, that's a major part of AUKUS, but for me, the benchmark of success or failure of AUKUS, it's not the submarine aspect, or at least the urgent part of it, it's not the submarine aspect, because that won't come in for another 10, 15 years. It's actually the next 5 years whether we can jointly develop what I'd consider more asymmetric capabilities. I'm talking about missiles, offensive cyber capabilities, unmanned drones and so on. Those are the sorts of things that Australia's hoping AUKUS will provide a foundation for. So hopefully that gives you, just to start off with, some grounding on why AUKUS was such a big deal for us and what it is that we're hoping to get out of it.
Right. And so taking from your comments, so I'm getting the impression that what Australia was looking for was the ability to project power, if you will, in the region, which Australia's military up till now has not really been designed around the idea of projecting power in the maritime environment especially.
Correct. I mean, we have some very significant niche capabilities that's fitted in seamlessly into the American capabilities, but in terms of actually projecting power and deterring a advanced potential enemy, we probably don't have those sorts of capabilities at the moment. So that's what we're trying to get.
Yeah, and so to speak from the nuclear submarine dimension, clearly that's the centerpiece of AUKUS. The nuclear submarines give you that reach, that speed to be able to be responsive. I think something that people don't often understand is the limitations of diesel-electric or air-independent propulsion submarines, how they're slow. So one problem is they're slow, and if they try to go fast, they end up depleting their oxygen or their batteries, and they have to snorkel more quickly. And it takes several days to get inside, from Australia. It takes several days under the cover of Chinese sensors to reach the South China Sea, and certainly even longer to reach the East China Sea. So,
well that's what I probably also should have mentioned about the nuclear sub decision and what that means. As you correctly say, the nuclear subs, will be able to operate far further from our coastlines, and that's quite significant change in the Australian mindset, because in the past, our existing submarines and the submarines that we wanted to build together with the French, they would have allowed us to operate really around our periphery. We didn't really have a conception of operating in Northeast Asia. So the nuclear submarines is essentially an indicator that we're quite serious about wanting to contribute to that either balance, military effort or deterrent element in Northeast Asia.
Right, and although clearly there's been plenty of examples of diesel-electric submarines doing transoceanic deployments, World War II, certainly the U.S., Japan, and Germany all pursued those. So it's not a matter of how far can you go or how long can you be there, because a diesel-electric submarine can deploy long enough for the food to run out, which is always the limitation on a submarine. But the challenge is how long can you go while remaining undetected, right? So if you have to make it 3 or 4 days to reach the South China Sea, but you have to snorkel after a couple, then that's a problem. Or if you're having to drive there so slow that you're only allowed a week left on station by the time you get there before you have to drive out again.
And obviously, if the Chinese know where our submarines are, then it diminishes them as strategic assets.
Right. So those are the things that drive you to nuclear. I think that's been one of the conversations out there is, well, why build a nuclear submarine? Why not just continue to build a better version of the diesel-electric submarines that we've had in the past? And it's this distance problem. It's this surveillance network problem. and it's having enough time on station to be able to do something militarily useful before you have to leave again to snorkel under these sensor networks that China has available to it. And so that leads to the challenge of, okay, well, getting a nuclear submarine for Australia. There's a couple of paths, but it seems like the Virginia-class submarine that's being built right now by the United States is probably the best option, just by virtue of the U.S. having the industrial base capacity that might be sufficient to allow that to be supported.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very early conversation, but the reality is that the brand new submarines are not due to come online till sometime in mid-2030s.
Right.
So the conversation is a very early conversation. There are potential options. I mean, one is if it were possible, it could be to lease a couple from the Americans. I mean, one of the problems Australia will have is, is one thing to have nuclear submarines, another thing to know how to operate them and integrate them into your military. So we obviously need to train ourselves up before we take acquisition of our first, nuclear submarine. So that's a possibility as well. Now, I think there's often an assumption it's going to be an American nuclear submarine.
Right.
I wouldn't necessarily make that assumption. I mean, there is the UK element.
Right.
The reason why I wouldn't necessarily make that assumption, and this is not a question that has been decided, but it's an initiative that we've got to look at. The British propulsion technology is obviously derived from the American one, but it could be that the way the British one is designed and needs to be serviced will be better suited to our industrial capabilities. We don't know that yet.
Right.
So I wouldn't completely discount that it may actually be a made-in-Britain submarine, not a made-in-America.
Right. Well, yeah, absolutely. And we can talk more about that and also what the options are to maybe stand up a nuclear submarine maintenance and training infrastructure in Australia. But Henry, I wanted to bring you into this discussion to talk a little bit about sort of the nuclear submarine gets a lot of attention. Maybe too much attention, and there's probably there are other benefits of AUKUS that we probably could explore. And is the proliferation risk involved in nuclear submarines going to another, a seventh country now that would have nuclear submarines? Is that a concern, or is that overblown?
Why don't I answer the last question? Yes, so that I have something
you can
to
proceed.
say. Because if I say no, well then also, I think forums talking about how to implement and what it is we're implementing are terribly important, because once you announce with presidents and head of states an intent to collaborate, you got to follow through. Because if you don't, there's a downside that has nothing to do with the substance and everything to do with the appearance that you don't really have allies. You have protectorates, or worse, you're about to fall apart. So I think the assumption of this panel is correct, and there need to be more panels like it. Whatever the proliferation or security risks are of AUKUS being implemented poorly or well, are nothing as compared to not having it now. Okay, so that's point number one. I think people need to get their head around that. I don't think if you do AUKUS perfectly with regard to the submarines, you're anywhere close to where you need to be to succeed from a security standpoint. And I'll get into that in a moment, why I think that. And I don't think inattention or self-righteous moral indignation that anyone would suggest that there is a proliferation problem with Australia is a complete thought, because there is a problem. And I think both of these problems can be addressed, but it requires doing something more than was announced by our governments. And what do I specifically have in mind? 2 lines of effort. First, given that the former foreign minister, I think at Labor, Gareth Evans, has come out in favor of the deal, but has said, of course, we're not going to enrich, right? And the Liberal government, currently in power, says, well, we aren't going to have a civil nuclear program. Since they've said this, it might be smart to take an additional step that only Australia could take, because I think if it comes from the US, it's not going to go down, and it's not going to go down well if it goes down. They might take a look at doing something in the upcoming NPT review conference, which is at the end of January in New York, And what would they do? They're going to get criticized by the Russians and the Chinese for lusting after nuclear systems. I think the way to push back on this is to point out whichever submarine we get, British, American, it's not going to be refueled in Australia. In fact, we don't even want title of the fuel. End of that discussion. We don't even need the IEA to figure out a new procedure. I think in addition, why can't the government forswear enriching and reprocessing? They can still even get into nuclear power, as Taiwan has, which is a nice little touch, and the UAE has, and encourage other countries to follow Australia's example. That would turn something that people claim is a non-proliferation problem into a non-proliferation solution. It'd be a nice touch. And it's traditional Australian flair to do this. The Australia Group was created, guess what, in Australia? It had to do with the control of chemical weapons. There's a tradition here. I think it would go over well with a divided government. I mean, the Liberals are holding by 1 seat. So, you know, it's okay to do something to please the other side. That is something the Australians need to think about, and it's an Australian matter. It's not something we can urge them to do effectively. They have to want to do it and tell us they want to do it. But if they did, I think it would make it even easier for the United States to make an exception in the 123 nuclear cooperative agreement we have with Australia to grant them the technology transfers necessary to make a U.S. or British submarine lease, construction, whatever it is, a lot easier. So that's the first thing. The second thing's bigger, though. It may be a little tougher, but I think it actually may be more important. I don't think you're going to prevent proliferation if this deal goes down and you don't address, in some fashion, what the South Koreans are thinking. Why? They want a nuclear submarine. They made it very clear. The Moon government, which is not particularly supportive of nuclear power, is supportive of getting a nuclear submarine and enrichment. Even Trump pushed back on this. But it's going to be harder now. What's interesting, there's a paper out there that I commissioned last year. It's going to be printed up by the Naval War College Review on why submarines for South Korea that are nuclear are not their best investment in anti-surface and underwater warfare, because they operate in relatively closed seas, and in some cases shallow seas, which is not the case for Australia, and arguably not the case for Japan either, but we'll get into that. Pointing that out isn't going to be enough. I think what you need to do is, expand the solution, or as the critics would say, the problem. We need another AUKUS, but we won't be doing submarines. I'm going to suggest something, and if you can find a better scotch, buy it, okay? In other words, I'm not wedded to these examples, but to just get the mind flowing. The United States and its spacefaring allies, including Australia and Europe and South Korea and Japan, have a problem. We don't really know well enough what's going on in space. And in particular, we also don't seem to know very much at all about what's going on near the moon. A lot of Chinese spacecraft going up there, hiding out, as far as some people think. Reason why is the moon's bright, and telescopes get blinded by that light. You need to get something up there, and you need a lot of surveillance in low Earth orbit, as we're discovering with today's news about ASATs and things like that. We're going to have to now keep track of a lot of bits and pieces now of Russian debris. The European Space Agency, which is primarily run by the French, ought to be encouraged with some promise of tech transfer and information transfer from the US to work with the South Koreans and us to build up a satellite system that can take care of that problem. I think that would send a message to China and to everyone that we intend to keep access to space free for everybody, but we do not intend to lose up there if there's fighting. Second thing you could do is, I think Japan in some metrics is far ahead of us in advanced computing. We should exploit that. I know lots of things are going on quietly. I think it shouldn't be so quiet. Advanced computing could be the key to getting secure communications and for making efforts to block communication, which is something the Chinese spent a lot of time doing, problematic. We ought to get the European telecoms, probably led by the Germans, something like that, I'm not wedded, some EU country, to work more explicitly with the US and Japan to stand up an initiative there. I think if you did that, you'd really do what AUKUS wants to do, which is to make the whole region engaged with Europe and the US in a way that is not necessarily in-your-face military acquisition of hardware, but of a general push that the trajectory is, no, we're not going to let you do whatever you want. There are other parties here. And I think with regard to the submarine, it does suggest maybe we need to expand that and start calling it the Undersea Warfare Initiative, because there are a lot of things we want to do with the Australians, with things that are submersible that aren't nuclear. We ought to start broadening it so we get that 5 or 6 year thing going. I think if you did all of this, it would make AUKUS great again.
So that's a great point, Henry, and thank you for giving it a bumper sticker, because that's, of course, essential to a successful program. So, John, you've talked before about the importance of the technology sharing elements of AUKUS beyond the submarine. What are some of those, and kind of what do you think does that present an example to make it more broadly about technology sharing for other allies to emulate?
Well, AUKUS is intended to be far more than subs.
Right.
As I mentioned in my opening remarks, the subs issue dominated, so AUKUS became equivalent to subs, but it's not. It's broader than that.
Right.
It is explicitly seen, certainly by Australia, as a industrial technological sharing agreement.
Right.
It was to give better effect to the 2017 decision for us when we entered your national industrial base. And of course, with the strategic aim of effectively balancing, deterring China as the major issue. Just before I get onto that question, just a quick response to Henry's first comment. And you guys know a lot more about nuclear submarines than I do, so correct me if I'm wrong. But my understanding of the American and British class submarines is that they don't need that the fuel stays in there for 35 years or so.
Right.
And once it's over, it's over. So you don't need to actually have the capability.
Correct.
And this was certainly the selling point of the coalition party, the Liberal Party, to the Labor Party. So the Labor Party would never allow us to have a genuine enrichment program domestically. In fact, the Australian population wouldn't be for it. Right. Even though they were for the idea of a nuclear submarine, if we didn't have to sort of, touch the dirty enrichment sort of area.
I agree.
Now, I don't know if that's a simplistic assumption technically, but certainly I think that's my understanding of why we chose the American and British as opposed to seeking out nuclear French submarines, for example.
Right.
On your question.
By the way, you can't make that point any too clear, because the non-proliferation community that I pad around in is just hell-bent on making the submarine operate on low enriched uranium, which would mean you would have to get your hands dirty, it would be opened up.
Right.
And if you can make it clear what you just said, it short circuits that.
Right.
And I think privately, there have been communications with very senior former non-proliferation assistant secretaries where they say, what's the problem? But it has not publicly been stated clearly enough to convince people that that's what's going on.
Yeah. Well, and look, that's an important point as well, Henry, diplomatically, because, as you know, as soon as countries like Indonesia or Malaysia hear the word nuclear linked
nuts.
with Australia, they go crazy. So that is something we need to explain to them properly. But on the other forms of cooperation or technologies, as I mentioned, Australia is not going to be, we're not in the same league as the Americans or the Chinese in terms of pure force projection of capabilities. But we can be a significant asymmetrical power, in terms of complicating things in various theatres for the Chinese and anyone else. So here I'm talking specifically about offensive cyber capabilities, and Australia is already one of the leading nations in that. I think what the path we haven't walked until very recently, we haven't thought of our cyber capabilities as offensive, and we don't really yet have this warfighting doctrines and operations to give effect to that. So this is something that we'll need to do with the Americans and the British. I say the Americans and the British because it's more easily done with Five Eyes partner than it is a non-Five Eyes partner. As I mentioned, we're only at the beginning of the conversation of missiles, including medium-range missiles, hypersonic missiles, land-based missiles, and I know you guys are relatively early in that process as well, but it's something that I think Australia would be probably quite interested to explore. And the third thing I mentioned was unmanned vehicles. And, the Chinese for 30 years have messed up American tactical thinking through asymmetrical capabilities. Now that the Chinese are a high-end power, it makes sense for other countries like us to sort of complicate and mess up the Chinese operational and tactical thinking on warfare. So that's why unmanned vehicles, drones and so on, swarm weapons become quite potentially quite attractive for us to develop together.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the U.S., one of the challenges the U.S. has with its ground-based missile systems, hypersonic weapons, is basing, right? The Philippines, Japan are probably not willing to host those kinds of long-range ballistic or hypersonic weapons, which the Army is developing now. Guam is not a great location because it's so far away, maybe, but so Australia could be a location from which those weapons could be based in concert with Australian forces. And as you said, unmanned vehicles, like Henry said, unmanned undersea vehicles could be an element of power projection also. And one thing the U.S. is finding in our own submarine operations is increasingly you have to fight your way in to places like the South China Sea because it is pretty well instrumented. They have their own versions of SOSUS, et cetera. So we're going to have to use unmanned undersea vehicles to some degree to do the seabed warfare so that you can actually get submarines into a place like the South or East China Sea.
I was going to say, just to back up that change in thinking for us anyway, I mean, if you look at the wars we've been involved with, with you guys in the last 3 decades, they've all been against far less advanced adversaries. So as I mentioned, it's the first time we're thinking about a war with a peer or near-peer competitor. And that term you just used, we have to fight our way in. That's a concept that's very alien, I think, to you guys and us. This is why these sorts of asymmetrical capabilities become important.
Absolutely. So there are a couple other things I want to ask you guys about with regard to technology transfer, but I know we have some questions in the audience. So if you have questions, please raise your hand, which I see there, and then we'll get the microphone over to you and just state your name and affiliation before asking your question. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you. That was great. This is Rebecca Heinrichs with Hudson Institute. Just two quick questions. One, timeline. It just seemed, I think AUKUS is the best thing that the Biden administration has done to show that they actually really are serious about taking on China. But it's as we already talked about here, it's 2030s before the nuclear submarine comes online. So it seems like Australia would have to lease a nuclear submarine in the time. I don't know any other option that would be credible for the purpose of deterring Chinese aggression. So can you talk about just the timeline and just give us a sense of what is Australia's sense of urgency to be making these decisions and getting them deployed and working faster than what it seems? And then my second question, what is the significance of China taking Taiwan? The reason I like to ask that question is because I think a lot of us gloss over that. We assume that everybody knows how bad that would be politically and just strategically, militarily for our allies in the region and for the United States. But if you can just address that too. And then also just give us a sense of what is the Australian population, if you can, just sort of the general sense of the perception of the threat from China. And how welcome AUKUS has been received to the general population.
Sure. First, quickly to timeline. As you're right to say that the submarines aren't meant to come on for 10, 15 years, or won't come on for 10, 15 years, and leasing them. Look, in my personal view, leasing them has been an option. One, because the timeline of potential conflict, say over the Taiwan Straits, it's probably shorter than 10, 15 years. And secondly, we need to learn how to operate these things, and integrate them into our sort of war concepts and so on. We can't do that without actually having Australians in a nuclear submarine. So the leasing issue hasn't really been spoken of publicly, as far as I'm aware, but I think it will have to be spoken of. With the urgency aspect, look, it's not that we have this strict timeline. It's more that the conventional thinking of Taiwan is that the PRC at the moment probably won't invade Taiwan because they can't land troops there at acceptable cost. They may have air superiority, undersea superiority, surface sea superiority. They can't land troops without massive losses. But there is a thinking that, sometime in the next 5 to 10 years they may be able to. And I know that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but it just means that the incentives for the PRC to use force, it may reach its peak in the next sort of 5 to 10 years. So from that point of view, that imposes some sort of timeline for us to actually at least think about. And this is why I keep mentioning the asymmetrical capabilities, which can come online sooner than obviously the submarines, and they need to. I think your question on the Australian perception, I can't remember your second question, but the third question on the Australian perception, Australia has been through a national journey on China. And as you know, Australia currently is now entering its second or third year of explicit economic coercion by China. Its leaders refuse to speak to our political leaders. And I think China really scored a home goal when in November last year, they released what's now infamously known as the 14 grievances. These are the 14 things Australia must do before we take our foot off your neck. And if you look at the 14 points, 9 of them concern our domestic policies. So it's not just about, stay out of Taiwan, don't mention Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, South China Sea. It was our domestic policy settings. Now, when the Australian people saw that, they essentially said this is not acceptable. And if you spend any time in Australia now, which at the moment you're not allowed to because our borders are closed, but when you go there eventually, you will find that the population, and it's revealed in all of the polling and all of your anecdotal experiences will match it. The attitude towards the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party is now so negative that when AUKUS came along, institutionally, publicly, even in the media, it was almost universally cheered, right? It was seen as a real, genuine indicator of Australia not wanting to submit and to Chinese demands, essentially. So and the Labor Party supported it straight away. There was no dispute or controversy about AUKUS. So this sort of tells you where Australia is, and it's the view of China as something that needs to be as a country it needs to be deterred and balanced against. That's pretty now entrenched at all levels of Australian society.
I'll weigh in too on this on the timeline question, but I really find it hard to believe that the Australian response was it's unacceptable. When they get the 14 points and it starts to influence impact domestic Australian policies. It seems like the response would have been maybe more aggressive than that.
Well, I should say the 14 points. Traditionally, when China has coerced other countries, they've always been an element of deniability.
Yeah.
we're stopping your shipments of so-and-so because of some regulation. With Australia, it's the first time China has explicitly said, we are punishing you economically for decisions you have taken on this, this, and this.
Yeah.
Right.
But on the timelines, I think you make a great point that there's this mismatch between the mid-2030s when we are arguing that a Virginia class or a British Astute class might be built in Australia, and then the late 2020s when we think China will be in a position to invade Taiwan. So those submarines could...
Or sooner.
Right, or sooner. Right. So late 2020s, and then in the mid-2030s, the submarines are finally available to help with the conflict that might already be over. So in the near term, I think the leasing option is an option, but it's problematic, right? Because the U.S. submarines that you could lease are going to need to be refueled, which means they need to go into a shipyard that is currently unavailable because those shipyards are stacked up and backed up with carriers and submarines here in the United States. So it's going to be hard to get a submarine that could be leased for Australia. The nearer term option would be to send U.S. submarines over to Australia and have them have combined crews with Australian and U.S. personnel. The Australian personnel could go through the U.S. training pipeline here, and that's really easy to kind of work them into the training program. And so you could have a cadre of trained operators that could be in Australia. They could do combined crews with the United States crews and have those ships operate out of HMAS Sterling and be able to provide an Australian nuclear submarine capability, but do it more quickly than you would be able to ever get a leased submarine or a built submarine in Australia. So I think that's probably the best option to try to get that submarine capability there earlier. But as John said, the asymmetric capabilities we're talking about, missiles, either hypersonic or ballistic, and unmanned systems, particularly unmanned undersea vehicles, could be a pretty effective tool that Australia could employ in the nearer term to try to help with a counter Taiwan invasion scenario. And as you mentioned, the Taiwan invasion, if it was successful, would be devastating economically for the world, in part because TSMC's chip factories would now be under direct Chinese control. Who knows what the results of that would be, as well as the fact that now China would have breached the first island chain and have access to Japan's Southwest Islands within minutes, and then access to the open ocean without the hindrance of having to go through any choke points that might be controlled by Australia, Japan, or the United States. So it would be devastating from an economic and a security standpoint if China was able to take over Taiwan. And there's obviously a lot of other third-order effects that I've been talking about.
There is a third-order effect, which is primary. We love talking about hot wars. The Chinese are interested. They're arming up. But if you read how they think, they're worried about breaking up alliances as the second thing, and defeating us in our minds. Let's try to get into that bubble a bit. Instead of just talking about hot, short wars, okay, which is what we love doing because, well, you buy stuff. And when you buy stuff, there's free food and, it's great. I think if you're talking about a long, cool war with China, we need to do a lot more than just work with Australia. We need to work with our other allies. And we have to try to make sure that they don't go their own way with regard to their programs, such that we end up with, I wouldn't say Finland's, but not operationally coherent military allies. We don't want that. Now, if that's the case, you need to stand up more trends than just talking about these submarines. That's number one. I think with regard to Taiwan, we're going to have to start shifting gears. And instead of talking about, well, what would happen if we lost Taiwan? I think we need to think about, well, what would happen if we held on to Taiwan? Or more important, it isn't ours. What if they held on to Taiwan? It is a major mystery to me how you modulate the behavior of the Communist Party in Beijing with Taiwan's demise as a free, self-governing government, because that's what it is. As long as they are self-governing, they are an example from which, if you will, it's an ideological battle cruiser, or better yet, aircraft carrier, from which you can suggest to the people of the world, and certainly China that they have choices. I don't see how you fight that very well if you let Taiwan go. You lose a positive advantage in the long, cruel war. And I don't think we're thinking enough about this. We're so caught up in hardware. I think that's the reason why I would expand the kinds of relationships, and you bet, bring the Europeans with all the challenges that that presents into the picture as much as we can, so that they buy product that they develop in Asia, and they keep China's product that would be a security problem out of certain markets. Now, there are lots of Chinese products, I gotta tell you, that are terrific. I'm not advocating that we stop buying those. I don't think Europeans are eager to stop buying them. But the things that cause security problems, we better figure out how to develop with the Asians and the Europeans and think more about markets that cannot be penetrated. None of that is a short, hot war. All of that is a long, cool one. And if the Chinese see where the trends are going, I think that will have an enormous effect on their behavior.
Great point. So I have pivoting here. I have a different question related to what the U.S. gets out of this. Because we keep talking about, well, what does Australia get out of it? What do our allies get out of this? So the U.S. obviously will get the benefit of having stronger alliances with East Asian countries. Are there ways that this agreement would help to kind of break some log jams, though, with regard to how the United States transfers technology and has the processes like ITAR and missile technology control regime, et cetera, that currently block the access of trusted partners and allies to U.S. technology? Is this like the battering ram we now use to open
my
up
center
those
has
floodgates?
been holding meetings for about a year now. You've been in a good number of them. We have figured out the most optimal way to defeat collaboration and innovation. It's called security procedures. If we do not recognize that we can no longer treat countries who we call allies like protectorates, that we're really going to have to take more risks and collaborate with them much more as equals, we're going to lose. And it may well be that we don't want to do that and we're willing to lose. And it may well be that we can't figure out how to do it. But boy, it's going to require changes. And we're going to have to be willing to take more risk and trust people more. You're not going to be able to train people on nuclear submarines without making an awful lot of changes. And you're certainly not going to be able to do the things I'm talking about without, opening up. I think we need to be thinking much more clearly about how to protect things that matter and stop protecting things that don't.
So, John, is this a frustration on Australia's part, the inability to get some technologies from the United States? And is AUKUS seen as a mechanism to start to smooth that?
Absolutely. When we were admitted into your national industrial base, your export controls didn't really change.
Right.
So nothing really happened. And, there are some people who sort of say, well, we could have just worked on export controls. You didn't need a grand announcement like AUKUS. Right. The thing that AUKUS does from a political level, it gives license and, in fact, makes a demand on institutions within the country to start focusing on proper collaboration, as Henry's talking about. So from that point of view, yes, you could have got to AUKUS in some ways if you sort of tinkered or made substantial changes to existing regulations and so on. But you do need that political drive from the top. And as Henry had mentioned, when you've got 3 heads of state standing up there announcing to the world, you've got to do it, right? I mean, the other thing that announcing AUKUS does, it obviously puts China on notice. And if AUKUS doesn't work, then China is actually in a more powerful position, right? So you've sort of put your stake in the ground now from the very top. And look, I think for developments to occur, political leaders have to do that and then get to the hard work of actually doing the nitty-gritty stuff.
Right, absolutely. Well, I think that's a great place to end it. I really appreciate the conversation, John and Henry, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Henry Sokolski, John Lee from Hudson Institute and the Nonproliferation Education Center. We appreciate you being here today for this Hudson and Nonproliferation Education Center event. And until next time, have a great day.
Thank you.